There was no light, no sound, only the pressure. The wood pressed against his chest like a second skin, close and splintered, every breath shallow and foreign. He couldn't move, his shoulders pinned, his legs bent unnaturally, his arms frozen at his sides. He tried to scream, but all that came out was a dry gasp, swallowed by the soil above. Air, thin, stale, laced with the scent of old wood, of damp earth and something else, ash. The taste lingered on his tongue, bitter and burnt, as if he'd swallowed a fire that had long since died. His throat scratched, raw, like he'd been shouting for days, but he couldn't remember saying a word, only silence. Endless, swallowing silence, and then the first sound, a ragged inhale, his own, then another, faster, too fast. The breath became panic. The panic became realization. He lifted his trembling hand, inches at most, until his knuckles brushed the wooden ceiling of his prison. The surface was rough, too rough, as if no one ever intended to smooth it, as if it was made not for rest, but for silence. He pushed, nothing, he pushed harder, still nothing. His fingers curled, nails dug into the grain, and then he scratched. A low, desperate noise echoed in the space too small to echo. Scratch, 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 the rhythm of the condemned. His breath caught in his chest, sweat beaded at his temples despite the cold. Is this death? But even as he asked it, the answer came. Not from a voice, not from a god, but from the truth. No, it's worse, because the dead are quiet, but he was still breathing, still begging, still buried. And above him, somewhere far beyond the rotting wood and packed earth, a bell tolled once faintly. But no one heard it for him. I once had a name. A simple name, whispered into my ear by my mother on the day I was born, baptized beneath the echoing bells of Santa Ligia Abbey. I can't remember her face anymore, but I remember the priest's hands lifting me into the air like an offering, like I was never meant to belong to the world, only to God. They said I was born to serve the faith. By the time I was 12, I had entered the Augustinian order. I could read Latin before I knew what love felt like. I studied scripture before I ever learned how to hold another person without trembling. Every morning, golden light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting violet and crimson patches across the cold stone floor. I used to think those colors were God smiling down on me. But then came the question, the one I should never have asked. If grace is unconditional, I said aloud during morning prayer, why must the poor pay in blood for forgiveness? No one answered, not with words anyway. Only with glances that turned sharp and cold, eyes that didn't blink, silence that grew heavy like a noose. I wasn't rejecting God, I just wanted to understand, but in that place a question could be a sentence. And mine was death in slow motion. They came for me at night, no ceremony, no prayer, just a rough sack over my head and the sound of quiet weeping behind me. I don't know who it was, maybe Brother Ilias, maybe one of the novices. Someone murmured a prayer, Lord, have mercy on this wayward soul. I don't know how far they dragged me or how long I lay in darkness before the light finally returned, flickering from an oil lamp swinging above me. I wasn't in a cell. I was in something else, something tighter, a chamber of stone and iron that smelled of sweat and mildew. There were no windows, no sun, no violet morning glow. Time stopped existing. No one called my name anymore. And slowly I stopped calling out to God, because if he had heard me, why had he let me end up here? I began to forget, first my name, then the faces of my brothers, then the words of the prayers I used to recite so faithfully. All that remained was one bitter truth. Those who ask too many questions are always answered with silence and soil, buried, forgotten, and left to scratch. At first I thought they'd return, that this was all a test. A punishment to humble me, an ordeal like the saints endured. I told myself stories in the dark, that this was penance, that the silence was holy, that if I endured it long enough, I would rise from this stone womb reborn. But the silence didn't feel holy, it didn't feel like anything. It was the kind that presses against your eardrums until you start to hear your own blood. It hums like a quiet scream that never fades, time unraveled. Days, weeks, maybe months. I stopped counting after the 12th time I scratched a tally into the wall and found it gone by morning. At first I blamed the damp, but then I noticed things had moved. The lamp would swing differently. The bucket would be closer than I remembered. One night the crucifix carved into the stone wall was gone, just vanished, like it had never been there. In its place, a patch of wall as smooth as bone. That's when I stopped sleeping. Something else was in here with me, or maybe not a thing, just awareness, presence. It didn't breathe, but it watched. You don't need eyes to feel it. You just know, the way animals know when they're about to be hunted. That primal certainty that something ancient and cruel is waiting in the dark, not to kill you, but to enjoy watching you unravel. I whispered to it once, "Are you God?" It didn't answer, of course it didn't, but the silence changed. No longer still, no longer quiet, it throbbed like lungs inhaling stone and dust. Sometimes I'd hear a drip that didn't echo, a creak that didn't belong. Once a voice, not words, just a sound, soft and wet, like breath caught in someone's throat. It came from the wall, from behind it, and it sounded like it was trying not to cry. That was the night I pressed my ear against the stones and whispered, "I'm still here." And something scratched back, not loud, just once. A single, dragging stroke, and then nothing. I sat there for hours, my head against the wall, too afraid to speak, too desperate to move, because in that scratch there was no cruelty, only recognition. Something or someone else was buried in the silence too, maybe long before me, maybe centuries, and I think they remembered what it meant to be forgotten. That's when the hunger started, not for food, but for voice. I wanted to speak. To scream, to force the world to remember me, but the stone walls didn't care, the church didn't care, and God, if he was listening, he'd stopped answering long ago, and so I did the only thing left. I began to pray again. Not for rescue, but to be buried deeper, so even the silence couldn't find me anymore. I wasn't alone. I say this now not because I heard a voice or saw a face, but because the stone itself began to remember. The chamber I was in, it started to change. I don't mean it shifted or cracked. No, it was more subtle than that, more cruel. The stones grew warmer some nights, colder others, as if they breathed in rhythm with something beneath. Something deeper, something that had been here longer than the Inquisition, longer than the prayers, longer than the lies. I began to dream with my eyes open. I would sit, sleepless, against the wall and see shadows that didn't belong to anything. Once I saw a flicker of light, not flame, not sun, but something that pulsed from under the floorboards like the heartbeat of the earth itself. And then I knew, this wasn't just a chamber, it was a mouth. A mouth lined with the memories of the dead. One night, while crawling to the corner to relieve myself, because yes, that was still my reality, I felt something shift beneath my fingers. Not stone, not dirt, fabric. I dug with what was left of my nails. Slowly, I pulled a piece of rotted cloth from the ground, and beneath it, bone, a small hand, still clenched. I didn't scream, I couldn't. My voice had grown too hoarse, too dry from weeks, months. Of silence, I only stared. That hand had once belonged to someone like me. Maybe a child, maybe a woman who questioned too loudly, maybe a man who begged the wrong saint. Whoever they were, they had not been recorded in any holy book. Their name was not sung in mass, their death had made no ripple. But here they were, still clenched in the earth. I whispered to them, apologies, secrets. The kind of stories you only tell the dead because only they will never use them against you. And for a moment, just one, I thought I heard the stone sigh, as if it pitied me. Then the scratching returned, louder this time, from all sides. Like nails, like teeth, and I realized the dead were not quiet because they were gone. They were quiet because they were listening. Time had no shape in that place. No sunrise, no bells, no wind. Only the breathing of the stone and the occasional scurry of something that didn't have a name. I had stopped counting the days long ago. What replaced numbers were voices, not voices I heard, but ones I imagined, or maybe remembered. I would sit in the corner, curled against the curve of the wall, and speak aloud as if someone were there, as if the bones beneath the floor were waiting for my confessions. I told them about the woman I loved once, years before the cell. She had hair like wildfire and a laugh that made people stop and listen without knowing why. I told the hollow ones about how I used to sing to her softly so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I told them how I watched her dragged away one night, not for blasphemy, not for witchcraft, but for refusing to renounce her laughter. I told the bones about the priest who smiled too much, the one who whispered verses while tying knots. I told them about the day I stopped praying, not because I lost faith, but because faith had never answered, not once, not even when the blood had dried beneath the altar steps. And the more I confessed, the warmer the room became. That was the worst part, not the cold, not the hunger, not even the silence. It was the warmth. It wrapped around my throat like a velvet noose. As if the room, this crypt, this buried womb of sorrow, approved of what I was saying. As if it wanted more, encouraged me to keep going. It fed on guilt, on grief, on honesty. Some nights I felt as though I could see them, the ones buried beneath me. They would rise only to the shoulders, no faces, just outlines of skin stretched over sorrow. They would lean toward me as if waiting to be fed not food but words, truth, shame, memory, and I gave it all to them, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. There was a hole in the wall, not large, just wide enough for a single eye to peer through. I hadn't noticed it at first. It was hidden behind a loose stone, smeared with mold, forgotten like the rest of me. But one night when I pressed my back against the wall for warmth, I felt a draft, warm, human, unnatural. I leaned in and listened. There was breathing, not the kind you hear from rats or other prisoners, not sharp or panicked. This was measured, intentional, as if someone on the other side was waiting for me to notice. When I whispered, "Who's there?" the breathing paused, then slowly, so slowly, a voice answered, "Do you miss the sun?" The voice was soft, almost polite. Not mocking, not cruel, worse than that, it was kind, as if it cared, as if it pitied me, but I didn't want pity, I wanted silence. "Go away," I said, but the hole never closed, and the voice returned. Not always words, sometimes just humming. A gentle melody the kind mothers might use to lull a child to sleep, but the tune didn't comfort me. It poisoned the silence. It made me feel watched. One night I shouted at it, cursed it, clawed at the stones, screamed until my throat bled. The voice did not reply, not for hours, and then finally it whispered, "That's better, I like the fire in you." I never spoke again. But it kept watching. I could feel it. The eye behind the wall, a presence that knew me too well. Not the guards, not a fellow prisoner, something else, something that had always been here. It knew my confessions, it knew my past. It knew the dreams I tried to forget. And sometimes, late at night, I could feel its breath not through the wall, but on my skin. It was no longer just listening, it was moving closer. It began with a sound, not a scream, not a whisper. A scratch, rhythmic, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the wall, not through it, inside. At first I thought it was a rat, a big one chewing at the stone, but this was different. It had a rhythm, a purpose. Scratch, pause. Like someone writing a name on the inside of a coffin. The eye hole I had once feared now pulsed with something darker, wetness. I leaned in and saw it, a thin, crimson line slowly oozing from the cracks in the stone. Blood, thick, real, warm. I touched it without thinking. It was sticky, fresh. My mind rebelled. Maybe another prisoner had died behind the wall. Maybe his body was rotting and the liquid found its way through. But no, there was no smell of decay. Just iron and something sweeter like syrup and rot. Then the humming began again. It wasn't behind the wall anymore. It was inside the cell. I turned slowly. No one. I checked the corners, crawled to the door. Banged on it until my fist split open. No one came, and then I looked down. The blood had followed me, a trail of it snaking from the wall to my feet. I tried to wipe it off, but it smeared, soaking into the fabric of my clothes, my skin, my nails. And suddenly the voice spoke, louder than it ever had. "Do you remember now?" I fell because I did. In that moment I remembered everything. The accusation, the cold hands dragging me to the tribunal, the man I betrayed to save myself. The girl I loved who burned because I said her name. The voice was not a ghost, it was my guilt, and it had taken shape. It had been waiting patiently until I was hollow enough for it to enter. Now it was no longer behind the wall. It was inside me. The walls didn't move, but I did, or at least I thought I did. It's hard to tell when time begins folding in on itself. I woke up on the floor, my cheek pressed against cold stone that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat buried under centuries of sin. The air felt thicker, not just heavy with moisture, but intentional, like something was watching me breathe and choosing when to let me stop. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling, the dried blood on my fingers cracking like old paint. The wall, the one that bled, was now dry, clean even, but the trail was gone, no sign of the red smear that had stretched across the floor just hours, minutes ago, and then I noticed the carving. Someone had etched a phrase into the wall in letters jagged and deep, "SHE waits." My stomach turned. I hadn't seen those words before. I hadn't written them, but I knew who had, her, the girl I had named to save myself. I staggered backward, but the room followed. Or maybe I just didn't move at all. Shadows clung to the corners of the cell like oil, viscous, shifting. The light from the single high window had dimmed to a sickly gray, like the sun no longer wanted to look inside. The walls began to speak, not with voices, but with memory. One showed me her eyes, wide with betrayal as the fire crawled up her legs. Another played the moment I said her name, hands shaking, my voice cracking, surrounded by monks with ink-stained fingers and eyes like winter. "You did it to live," the walls seemed to say, "so now live with it." And I understood with a certainty that chilled my marrow. This wasn't a prison. It was a sentence, not from the Inquisition, but from something older, deeper. Something that punished not with death, but with remembering. I began to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it meant I'd be here forever. And so would she, not behind the wall, but beside me. Waiting for the moment my guilt would be heavy enough to open the door. I don't remember falling asleep, only that I woke to the sound of fingernails again. But this time, they weren't behind the wall, they were beneath the floor. A steady, scraping rhythm, patient and methodical, like someone tunneling up from the belly of the earth. Each scratch echoed in my spine like a whisper I couldn't unhear. I pressed my ear to the ground, not to listen, but to understand. And what I heard was not a creature clawing toward freedom. It was someone returning home. The stones were colder now, damp with breath. When I stood, the message on the wall had changed. The jagged letters that once read, "SHE waits," now read, "You're next." My mouth dried. I stepped back, but the floor pulsed once, like something underneath had felt me move. And then the corner of the room split open, not with a crack or a boom, no drama. Just a silent shift in the mortar, as if the building itself was giving permission. From the gap, a smell leaked out, rotten cloth, burnt oil, and something sweet, like lilacs rotting. A hand appeared, pale, thin, the fingernails blackened and cracked. It rested gently on the floor like it had always belonged there, like it had been waiting for someone to see it without screaming. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat closed like a fist. Then came the second hand. And slowly, so slowly, it mocked death itself. A head followed, hair that moved in clumps, skin stitched by shadows, eyes hollow but knowing, not the eyes of a monster or a ghost, the eyes of someone who remembered everything. She crawled into the room without breaking eye contact. Her lips didn't move, but I heard her speak in the space between my heartbeats. You made them believe it was me. I wanted to explain, to beg, to kneel. But she wasn't here for an apology. She didn't want my sorrow. She wanted what I took, my second chance. She rose to her feet, bones cracking like frozen branches. "Let's trade places," she said, though her mouth never moved. And the stones agreed. My legs gave out, the room tilted, and when I looked again, the wall was sealed. She was gone, but so was the door, and in the silence that followed, I heard it again. Fingernails scraping, this time they were mine. There is no time in this place, not really. Only moments that stretch like skin too tight over bone. I don't know how long I've been here, maybe hours, maybe centuries, but the cell is different now. It breathes. The walls pulse faintly as if they've grown a heart of their own, a slow, wet beat that reminds me I am not alone. Not anymore. The stones whisper now, not in words but in regrets, in sins that aren't mine and some that are. They show me flashes, visions in the cracks, a mother weeping for a child she was forced to abandon, a priest smiling as he seals the wall behind a young girl's screams, a boy buried beneath the floorboards of a convent, clutching a rosary too tightly to bleed. I see all of them, I feel all of them, and they feel me. That is the curse of this place. You do not die here, you remember, over and over again. Sometimes I see her, the one I left behind, the one I blamed. She stands just beyond the stone arch, her face blurred like wet paint, watching. Sometimes she smiles, sometimes she doesn't, but she never speaks again. She no longer needs to. Her silence is punishment enough. I tried to claw at the walls once, bloodied my fingers down to raw sinew, but the stone only absorbs it like it's thirsty, like it's grateful. And then it heals, not my fingers, the wall, as if I'd never touched it, as if it's mocking me. This cell is not a room, it's a mirror. It shows me the cost of cowardice, of silence, of pretending you didn't hear the scratching on the other side of the wall until it stopped. There's no exit, no judgment, only memory, and the memory never stops. It grows, it wraps itself around your lungs, coils through your spine until even your dreams bleed echoes. So I sit now. I sit and I wait for the next soul who will hear scratching through their wall and choose to do nothing. And when they come, when they cross into this place, I will welcome them with open arms, because the cell has room. It always has room.